The Force is light and full of shadows.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive Timelines members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The lightsaber was already in his hand. That was the first thing he noticed, not the cold. Not the smoke threading up from the lower districts like incense burned for a dead god. Not the 300 men in blue-trimmed armor standing at his back in perfect, terrible silence. The lightsaber, his hand, the left hand, flesh and bone, wrapped around a hilt that should have been impossible to hold with this much sensation. And the right, the mechanical one, the one Dooku had taken from him on Geonosis 3 years ago, replaced with durasteel and synth skin and servos, gripping with that familiar quarter-second delay between thought and motion. He stopped breathing, not the mechanical cessation of a respirator cycling between states, an actual stop, voluntary. The lungs simply forgetting their purpose, because the mind above them had just been struck by something that had no name in any language spoken in this galaxy. The night air of Coruscant moved across his face, across skin. He felt the particulate bite of smoke in his nose, the faint chemical rot of something burning 3 kilometers south, the specific cold of a Coruscant upper district night that came not from any natural weather system, but from the shadows between towers tall enough to block the heat retention of the city below. He felt all of it. He hadn't felt anything through a nose in 23 years. His left hand opened, closed. The lightsaber shifted, and the grip adjusted, and the fingers responded with the immediate, total, terrifying intimacy of a hand that was his, that had always been his. His right hand, the mechanical one, moved with its familiar slight lag, the absence of true sensation that he'd learned to live with, that he'd stopped mourning because mourning it meant mourning everything that came after. It was still there, still mechanical, a reminder that this timeline hadn't erased everything. But the rest of him, he turned both hands over in the dark, palms up, like a man checking for wounds he already knows are there. The left hand, flesh. The right hand, durasteel wrapped in synth skin that felt like rubber against his palm. He pressed the thumbnail of his left hand into the mechanical palm of his right and felt nothing on that side, but felt everything on the left, pressure, the small bright signal of sensation traveling up through his wrist, his forearm, his shoulder, arriving in a brain that had forgotten what an unmediated message from a real hand felt like. But his lungs worked. He drew breath without a respirator forcing the rhythm. His face, he reached up with his left hand and touched skin. Not a mask, not the cold plasteel of a helmet that had become more face than the ruined flesh beneath it. His legs moved without the hydraulic assistance of a suit that kept him standing because his own spine had been burned too badly to do the work alone. Something behind his sternum cracked open. He closed both hands, flesh and metal, before it could go further. Not now. The thought arrived in the cadence of the man he had been for 23 years. Flat, tactical, a door sealed against a flood that would drown him if he let it. He had learned to speak to himself that way because the alternative was the thing that lived in the suit with him, the grief that Palpatine had taught him to convert into fuel, and he had run on that fuel for so long that stopping felt like dying. He was not going to let it drown him. Not here. Not with 300 men at his back and the Jedi Temple 40 meters in front of him, and everything still in motion. He breathed instead, drew the night air in deliberately, feeling his rib cage expand, feeling the slight resistance at the top of the breath that was muscle and cartilage rather than a pressure seal equalizing. Held it, released it. The most ordinary act in the galaxy, and he nearly came apart performing it. He looked up. The Jedi Temple rose before him like an accusation. He had stood here before. Stood in this exact geography with armor that turned the world into a filtered sensor feed, with lungs that worked only because a machine permitted it, with a body that was more sarcophagus than flesh. He had stood here and walked through those doors and done what he had been sent to do. He remembered the torchlight on the walls inside. He remembered the sound. He remembered the face of the first Jedi who had turned to find him there, the expression that moved through confusion and recognition and understanding in the space of a single second before the blade fell. He remembered the map room. He stopped that line of memory with the same flat authority he used on everything else that would kill him if he let it run. Read the board? The 501st stood in formation behind him. He could feel them without turning. 300 individual Force signatures, faint the way non-sensitives were always faint, but present. The specific texture of men who were afraid of something they couldn't name and were overriding it with training. He knew that texture. He had commanded these men across 3 years of war. He knew the shape of their collective discipline, the way a conductor knew an orchestra. He also knew what was happening inside their skulls. Commander Apo stood 4 meters to his left, and slightly behind, the command position, the correct distance for a senior officer accompanying a general. Anakin knew without looking that Apo's hand was loose at his side, not on his weapon, which meant the chip had not yet reached the threshold where it demanded action. The order had been received. The order was active, but the chip amplified existing military conditioning, and existing military conditioning said you did not move on an objective until your commanding general gave the word. He had not given the word. He had been standing at the top of these steps in silence for, how long? 3 seconds. 4. Long enough for Apo to notice. Long enough for the men nearest the front of the formation to exchange the kind of look that soldiers exchanged when something was wrong with the officer in command, and none of them knew how to address it. He turned away from the temple doors and looked at the city instead. Coruscant spread below the temple mount in every direction, a civilization dense enough to have its own gravity, tower blocks rising so close together that the sky between them was just another corridor. In the south, 3 separate fires were burning. He could see the orange pulse of them against the undersides of the cloud layer that perpetually trapped the city's heat. Senate District was 2 kilometers west, its administrative towers lit against the dark because the Senate never fully slept. Palpatine's office, the private hangar, the hidden passage behind the second panel of the meditation alcove that opened onto a turbolift descending to a sealed room that didn't exist on any architectural record because he had helped authorize its construction. Not in this life. In the other one. He reached into the Force. It came back to him like a tide coming in, not the filtered, damaged, suit-mediated connection he had lived with for 2 decades, where reaching for the Force felt like trying to grip water through a gauntlet, but the full, unmediated connection of a body with 20,000 midichlorians per cell, and nothing between them and the living Force but intention. It was almost violent in its completeness. He had forgotten what this felt like. He had told himself he hadn't forgotten, that the suit merely diminished it, that the connection persisted. That had been a lie he told himself to continue functioning. This was what it had actually been. He reached west, toward 500 Republica. He found her immediately. Her Force signature was as specific and unmistakable as a voice, and he would have known it in a star cluster of a million others. Alive, warm, frightened in the way she was always frightened when she understood that something catastrophic was happening and didn't yet have enough information to counter it. And beneath her signature, twin presences, small and dense and extraordinary, burning with a Force sensitivity so concentrated it left an afterimage when he pulled his attention back. Alive, all 3 of them, alive. He reached north and east, toward the Senate complex. Palpatine's presence was immediately distinct, that specific darkness that practiced void disguising itself as warmth. Triumphant, still in motion, the Sith Lord who had just destroyed the Jedi Order was now managing the political theater of consolidating what he'd won, and he was doing it with the serene efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 30 years. He had perhaps 90 minutes before Palpatine expected a status report from the temple operation. When that report didn't come, he would send a query. When the query went unanswered, he would send someone to investigate. The margin was not generous. He came back to himself on the temple steps. Apo's hand was no longer loose at his side. It was not on his weapon. But it was no longer loose. Anakin turned. He took in the formation with the commander's eye, not the sweep of a man reviewing soldiers, but the specific, rapid read of someone cataloging the micro-variables that determined whether the next 30 seconds would require force. 3 troopers in the second rank were showing the slight forward weight shift that preceded involuntary movement. 2 more on the left flank had their helmets angled toward the temple doors rather than toward him, which meant the chip's objective orientation was already pulling their attention. Apo himself was running a visible internal conflict behind the visor. The set of his shoulders said orders received, awaiting execution, but the stillness of him was too deliberate, the stillness of a man holding himself in place rather than simply standing. He had, at his most optimistic estimate, 4 minutes before the chip's imperative overcame the formation's deference to command. Anakin Skywalker, and it was that name, not the other one. Not the title the black suit had made synonymous with death, but the name he had been given in a desert by a woman who believed her son would come back, looked at Commander Apo and said, with complete and untroubled calm, "Hold position. No one enters." Apo's visor caught the torchlight from the temple's outer sconces. In its reflection, warped and orange, the temple doors loomed behind Anakin's shoulder like a held breath. The hand that had been moving, slowly, incrementally, with the terrible patience of a mechanism rather than a choice, stopped. Anakin watched it stop. He watched the exact moment where military conditioning beat the chip's imperative by a margin so theoretical, and he filed the information with the cold precision of a man who understood that this margin would narrow with every minute he didn't give the 501st somewhere else to point. He had bought himself, perhaps 4 minutes. He intended to use all of them. Commander Apo's hand remained motionless for exactly 2 seconds. Then it moved again, not toward the blaster, toward his helmet. He reached up with his left hand and keyed the internal comlink with the kind of slow deliberation that came from a man trying to maintain protocol while his brain was being pulled in 2 directions by forces he didn't have names for. "General." His voice came through the helmet's vocabulator with the flat affect of a man under extreme discipline. The order came directly from the Chancellor's office. Republic command frequency. Authentication code valid. All units received. "I know what you received, Commander." Anakin said it quietly. He had learned a long time ago, in the life that hadn't happened yet, the one he was currently preventing, that volume was not authority. Palpatine had taught him that, in the same way Palpatine had taught him most of the things that made him efficient at destroying what needed destroying. The Emperor never raised his voice. He made the silence do the work. Anakin stepped down off the top platform of the temple stairs, not toward the 501st, toward Apo specifically. 3 steps, close enough that the commander could see his face clearly in the firelight from the distant burning districts, far enough that it didn't read as aggression. "How many operations have you run under my command, Apo?" The question landed wrong. Apo's helmet tilted slightly, a micro-movement that would have been invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 3 years learning to read clone body language through armor. "General, I don't see how many?" The question had become an order by virtue of repetition, and orders were the only language the chip couldn't argue with. 47 confirmed combat deployments, sir. Estimate another 120 ship actions, boarding operations. And in how many of those did I abandon the objective? Silence. In how many did I get you killed because I didn't read the tactical situation correctly? Apo didn't answer. The answer was 0, and both of them knew it, and making him say it would have been cruelty for its own sake. Anakin kept his voice level. "I am reading the tactical situation now, and I am telling you the temple is not the objective. Sir, the order specifically, the order you received is based on intelligence I now know to be incomplete." It was a lie. It was also the only framework Apo's mind could hold without the chip turning him into something that would force Anakin to put him on the ground. And Anakin was not going to do that. Not to Apo. Not to any of them if he could avoid it. He watched the commander process it, watched the exactness of military reasoning encounter the absolutism of the chip's directive, and try to find a structural compromise between them. "General, if there's updated intelligence, it should have come through command. It came through me." Anakin turned away from Apo and raised his voice. Not a shout, just enough to carry across the formation. "Senior officers, advance." The 501st didn't hesitate. They were too well trained for hesitation. Within 4 seconds, the 5 senior sergeants and the 2 lieutenant-rank officers had broken from their positions and were moving up the steps in a loose cluster. They formed a half circle at the top, 5 meters from Anakin, close enough to hear him without the rest of the formation catching every word. Apo joined them last. His posture was still wrong, too rigid, the kind of rigidity that came from holding something down rather than standing at ease. But he was there. Anakin looked at each of them in turn. He knew their names, all of them. He knew which ones had a tendency to showboat in the mess, which ones were quiet and vicious in close quarters, which ones wrote letters they would never send to families that didn't exist. He had watched them for 3 years. In another life, he had given the order that turned them into the instrument that burned the Jedi Temple to its foundations, and he had walked away while they did it because Palpatine told him it was necessary, and he had believed him. He was not going to do that again, "There is a coordinated separatist counterstrike being prepared against the Senate District," he said. "Intelligence indicates sleeper agents embedded in the Chancellor's security detail. The temple is a diversion. It has no ships, no orbital defenses, no method of retaliation. It is a stationary target that will still be here in 6 hours." He let that sit for half a second, then continued. "The Senate District has hangar bays, private shuttles, and direct access to the orbital defense grid. If separatist operatives seize control of any one of those systems while we are occupied here, the Chancellor becomes a target of opportunity. The temple can wait. The Senate cannot." It was tactically plausible. That was the only thing that mattered. It didn't have to be true. It had to be possible. And it had to give the chip's imperative a competing priority that invoked the one authority the clones had been bred to serve above all others: the safety of the Supreme Chancellor. One of the sergeants, Crest, a man who had held the line at Jabeam when the entire ridge was collapsing into mud and fire, tilted his helmet toward Appo. "Commander, the General's tactical record is not the issue, Sergeant." Appo's voice was strained now. The chip was fighting him harder. Anakin could see it in the way his hands had both moved to his belt. Not to weapons, just to something, the way a man in pain gripped the edge of a table. Anakin stepped closer to Appo. Close enough that none of the others could see the commander's face through his visor, but Anakin could see the faint reflection of his own face in it. "You feel it, don't you?" He said it quietly, not a question. Appo said nothing. "You feel the order, you feel it like it's coming from somewhere that isn't you, and you don't know why." Appo's breathing was audible now through the helmet. Shallow. Rapid. "I know why," Anakin said, "and when this is over, I will explain it to you. But right now, I am giving you a direct battlefield command that supersedes the previous directive. The 501st is redeploying to the Senate District. Full perimeter lockdown, no one in, no one out. You will establish containment positions around every hangar bay, every executive landing platform, and every route between the Chancellor's office and external access." He paused. "And you will do it because I am your general, and I have never once given you an order that got you killed when I could have given you one that kept you alive." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the specific tension of men whose training was arguing with something that had been written into their genetics before they were conscious enough to have opinions about it. Appo's hand moved. It didn't go to his blaster. It went to his comlink. "All companies," he said. His voice was hoarse, but it was steady. "New operational directive. We are redeploying to Senate District on General Skywalker's authority. Prepare for immediate march. Priority containment. Executive hangar bays and orbital access points." The formation below didn't cheer. They didn't question. They simply began to move, because that was what the 501st did when Commander Appo gave an order. Anakin watched them begin the turn. 300 men rotating from a siege formation into a march column, with the kind of efficiency that came from doing this exact maneuver 100 times under fire. He looked at Appo. The commander's helmet was still angled toward the temple. "You're lying to us, sir." Anakin didn't flinch. "Yes. The order to execute the Jedi came from the Chancellor. You're countermanding it." "Yes, that's treason." "It is." Appo's hand was on his blaster now, not drawing it, just resting there. The chip had finally given him a clear directive, and his body was preparing to follow it, and the only thing stopping him was 3 years of walking into gunfire behind a man who had never once left him to die. Anakin met his gaze through the visor. He didn't reach for his lightsaber. He didn't move. "The Chancellor is the threat, Appo," he said quietly, "not the Jedi, and I am going to deal with it. You can shoot me, or you can trust me one more time." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the lower city, another building caught fire. The orange glow reflected off the white armor of 300 men, who were waiting for their commander to decide whether their general was still their general or a traitor who needed to be executed in the street. Appo's hand came off the blaster. "If you're wrong, sir, I'm not." Appo turned toward the formation. He didn't acknowledge what had just happened. He simply raised his voice and said, "Double-time march. Establish perimeter before the Senate's night shift rotation ends. Move." The 501st moved. Anakin watched them descend the temple steps in formation, watched them flow past him like a river redirecting, watched Appo take his place at the head of the column without looking back. He stood alone at the top of the steps as the last trooper passed. The temple doors were still sealed, The fires in the lower city were still burning, and across Coruscant, in a luxury tower with a view of the Senate, a woman who didn't know she had hours left to live in the original timeline was standing at a window with her hand on her belly, watching the city burn, waiting for her husband to come home. He had perhaps an hour before Palpatine noticed the 501st wasn't reporting from the temple, perhaps 90 minutes before the Sith Lord sent a direct query, perhaps 2 hours before the entire plan collapsed under the weight of a question Anakin couldn't answer without revealing everything. He turned toward the temple doors. He had told Apo the temple could wait. That had been a lie too. The people inside, the Jedi who didn't know what was happening, who were about to come under siege from an army they didn't know had already been turned against them. They had minutes at most before someone less patient than Apo decided to follow the original order. Anakin descended the steps, not toward the 501st column marching toward Senate District, toward the temple's eastern service entrance, the one that bypassed the main security atrium, the one he knew about because in another life he had helped design the Imperial occupation's retrofit of this exact building. The temple didn't know he was coming to save it. It wouldn't trust him when he tried. He ignited his lightsaber, blue, still blue, the crystal uncorrupted, and cut the lock. The service corridor smelled like stone and old incense. Anakin had forgotten that. In the Imperial occupation, they had stripped the temple down to its structural bones and rebuilt it as an administrative complex, sterile and functional, every surface polished to the kind of shine that suggested power rather than contemplation. The smell had been the first thing to go, replaced with recycled air and the faint ozone tang of too many holoprojectors running simultaneously in enclosed spaces. Here, now, it still smelled like what it was, a place where people came to be quiet. He moved through the eastern maintenance passage with the certainty of someone who had walked these halls 1,000 times, which he had, but not in this life. The service entrance bypassed the main atrium entirely. It was used by maintenance crews, by initiates running errands to the lower archives, by anyone who needed to move through the temple without being seen. He had used it as a Padawan when he wanted to avoid Obi-Wan after a particularly pointed lecture. He had used it as a knight when he needed to slip out to see Padmé without half the council tracking his movements. He had used it as Darth Vader when he came back to walk through the ruins. The corridor ended at a security door, biometric lock, Jedi-only access. He placed his left hand against the scanner, keeping his mechanical right hand at his side. The scanner read his flesh palm as Anakin Skywalker, Jedi Knight, clearance valid, and the door opened. He stepped into the main entrance hall. Sin Dralig was waiting for him. The battlemaster stood 30 meters away in the center of the hall, lightsaber already ignited, green blade, Soresu grip, the defensive posture of a man who had been teaching younglings how not to die for 20 years and had no intention of dying himself. Behind him, spread in a loose defensive arc, were 12 temple guards in their ceremonial masks and formal pikes, and behind them, partially obscured by a support column, 4 Padawans too young to have been sent to the war, but old enough to know what a battle stance looked like. Dralig's voice carried across the stone floor with the exact clarity of a man who had spent a lifetime projecting over the sound of training sabers. "Stop where you are, Skywalker." Anakin stopped. He didn't ignite his own saber. He kept it in his left hand, unlit, held low at his side in a way that said armed, but not attacking. His mechanical right hand hung at his side, visible, non-threatening, the posture of a man who had come to talk and was ready to fight only if talking failed. "Master Dralig, you came with the 501st. Dralig's blade didn't waver. I felt them assemble outside. 300 men in siege formation at our door, and you at the head of them. So before you say one more word, you will explain why I shouldn't cut you down where you stand." It was a fair question. Anakin looked past Dralig toward the temple guards. He knew some of them. Not by name. The guards operated under anonymity as a point of discipline. But he recognized the way one of them held his pike, the slight forward weight that marked him as someone who had transitioned from field combat to ceremonial duty and never fully shaken the field instincts. He knew the architecture of their training, because Dralig had taught it to all of them, and Dralig taught exactly one way. You put yourself between the threat and what you were protecting, and you did not move until the threat was gone. They would not move. He brought his gaze back to Dralig. "The clones have received an order to kill every Jedi in the galaxy," he said. "It came from Palpatine. It's already active. Masters are dying on Megiddo, on Kashyyyk, on Utapau, right now because the men they've been fighting beside for 3 years just turned on them." Dralig's expression didn't change. "And you know this how?" "Because I was standing in the Chancellor's office when he gave it." One of the Padawans behind the column made a small sound, not quite a gasp, more like the intake of breath that came before a question that wouldn't be asked because the situation was too dangerous to interrupt. Dralig's blade angled slightly forward. "Not an attack, a preparation for one." "Then you're exactly what I thought you were. Palpatine's weapon, his executioner. And you came here to—" "I came here to stop it." Anakin said it with the flatness of a man stating a tactical objective rather than making a moral argument. He had learned in the other life that moral arguments didn't survive contact with people who had already decided you were the enemy. Tactics did. Outcomes did. "The 501st is not entering this temple," he continued. "I've redirected them to Senate District. They're holding perimeter there. You have maybe 90 minutes before Palpatine realizes I've countermanded his order and sends someone else. So you can fight me, or you can seal the lower levels and get everyone who can't fight into the archives, where they can be defended from a single choke point." Dralig stared at him. The Battlemaster's face was doing something complicated, moving through suspicion, evaluation, the specific calculation of a man who had taught combat theory to 15 generations of Jedi and knew exactly how much truth could coexist with lies when someone was playing a deeper game. "You expect me to believe," Dralig said slowly, "that you marched the 501st to our door and then changed your mind?" "I didn't change my mind. I never intended to follow the order." Anakin met his eyes, "Because if I hadn't, someone else would have led them, and that someone wouldn't have stopped." The silence that followed was broken by a voice from the left archway, calm, measured, carrying the particular authority of someone who outranked everyone in the room and didn't need to raise her voice to prove it. "Lower your blade, Sin." Shaak Ti stepped into the entrance hall. She was alone. No escort, no visible weapon, though Anakin knew she had her lightsaber in the sleeve of her robe, because Shaak Ti was never unarmed in a tactical situation. She moved into the open space between Dralig and Anakin with the deliberate calm of someone walking into a standoff she intended to diffuse rather than escalate. Dralig didn't lower his blade. "Master T, this is—" "I know what this is." She looked at Anakin. Her expression was unreadable, but her Force presence was clear. She was afraid, but not of him. She was afraid of what he had just said, because unlike Dralig, she had been feeling the disturbances in the Force for the past 30 minutes, and had been trying to convince herself they were localized anomalies rather than the pattern they actually were. "You said Palpatine gave the order." Her voice was quiet. "Not the Senate, not the military command structure. Palpatine personally." "Yes, and the clones obeyed. They're bred to obey, and there's a reason they obeyed this specific order without question. But I don't have time to explain it. You need to get everyone into the secured sections now." She was reading him through the Force the way she had read 1,000 opponents in combat, the way every consular learned to read intention and deception and the space between them. What she found made her go very still. "You feel different," she said. Anakin said nothing. "Your Force presence. It's—" She stopped. She didn't have the words for what it was, because there were no words for older, for grief that has already finished, for the signature of someone who had lived through his own death and come back carrying the weight of it. She looked at Dralig. "Lower your blade. Master T, lower it." Dralig's jaw worked. Then, slowly, he deactivated his lightsaber. The green blade retracted with the familiar snap hiss that was the same across every saber ever built, and the sudden absence of its light made the hall feel darker than it had been before he ignited it. Shaak Ti turned back to Anakin. "How long do we have?" "Hours at most. Maybe less if the 501st silence gets flagged faster than I think it will." "And you believe we're safe from the clones as long as we stay inside?" "You're safe from the 501st. I can't speak for any other unit. If Palpatine sends the Coruscant Guard or pulls a battalion from off-world, I won't be able to stop them the same way. Then we fortify." Shaak Ti's voice shifted into the register she used when she was commanding rather than asking. She looked at Dralig. "Seal the main entrances. Temple guards on the primary choke points. Archives. The meditation levels, the hangars. Get the initiates and the younglings into the vault. Anyone who's not combat rated goes with them." Dralig nodded once. He turned toward the temple guards and began issuing orders in the clipped shorthand of someone who had run evacuation drills so many times that the words were muscle memory. The guards moved. The Padawans followed. Within seconds, the entrance hall was emptying, bodies flowing toward the interior corridors, with the efficiency of people who knew exactly where they were going, because the temple's layout was written into their bones, the same way the Jedi Code was. Shakti waited until they were alone. Then she looked at Anakin with the expression of someone who was about to ask a question she didn't want the answer to. "Why are you doing this?" Anakin looked at her. He could have lied. He could have told her it was duty, or strategy, or some version of the truth that was small enough to fit inside a sentence that wouldn't break the fragile trust she was offering him. He told her the truth instead, because in another version of this night, I walked through those doors with the 501st behind me, and I killed everyone inside. Masters, knights, Padawans, younglings, everyone. And I did it because Palpatine told me it was the only way to save my wife, and I believed him. Shakti stared at him. "And when it was over," Anakin continued, his voice flat, "she died anyway. And I spent the next 23 years serving the man who turned me into the thing that killed her. So no, Master T, I am not doing this because I'm a good person. I'm doing this because I already know what happens if I don't." The silence between them was broken by a sound from the eastern corridor. Small, tentative, the shuffle of feet that belonged to people who were too young to know when to stay hidden. Anakin turned. 5 younglings stood at the corridor entrance. The same 5, the same faces. The Rhodian boy with the oversized training saber, the human girl who had looked at him in the map room and asked Master Skywalker, "What are we going to do?" moments before he killed her. They were staring at him. He couldn't move. His left hand was still on his lightsaber hilt, his mechanical right hand hung at his side, and his lungs were still pulling air. But the space between one breath and the next stretched into something that had no measurement, because time didn't work correctly when you were looking at the faces of children you murdered. The Rhodian boy took a step forward. "Master Skywalker?" His voice was small, uncertain. "Master T said we should go to the vault, but we wanted to make sure you were okay. You looked sad." Anakin's throat closed. Shakti moved between him and the younglings with the smooth interception of someone redirecting a situation before it collapsed. She knelt to the Rhodian's eye level and said gently, "Master Skywalker is fine, but he's very busy keeping us safe. You need to go with the others right now." The children hesitated. Then the human girl, her name was Lyra, he remembered now. She had been 9 years old, looked past Shakti directly at Anakin and said, "Thank you for protecting us." Anakin stood in the entrance hall and watched them disappear into the corridor. He watched until the sound of their footsteps faded completely. He watched until there was nothing left to see except empty stone and the low light from the sconces, and his own reflection in the polished floor. Shakti stood. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had seen his face. "I need to go," Anakin said. His voice came out hoarse. "Palpatine's in the Senate building. If I don't deal with him tonight, none of this matters. You're going to kill him." "Yes." Shakti looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "May the Force be with you, Anakin Skywalker." He turned toward the service entrance. He made it 3 steps before he stopped and looked back at her. "When Obi-Wan gets here," he said quietly, "tell him I'm sorry, for all of it." Then he walked out of the temple, leaving the Jedi alive behind him, and went to kill the man who had made him into a monster, 23 minutes earlier. Padmé Amidala stood at the window of her apartment and watched Coruscant burn. Not the whole city, not yet, but 3 separate fires were visible from her vantage point. In 500 Republica, orange blooms against the dark, each one marking a district where something had gone catastrophically wrong. She didn't know what. The news feeds were chaos, half of them offline, the other half running contradictory reports about separatist attacks and military deployments and a Senate emergency session that had been called and then postponed, without explanation. She had tried calling Anakin 4 times. His comlink went straight to dead air, not even a voicemail prompt, which meant either the device was destroyed or he had manually disabled all incoming communication. Neither option was comforting. Behind her, Captain Typho moved through the apartment's main room, with the controlled urgency of a man running security protocols he had hoped never to use. He was checking sightlines, verifying that the blast shutters were functional, confirming the building's emergency exits were clear. Dorme was with him, ostensibly helping but mostly just staying close to Padme in the way she did when situations moved past, concerning into dangerous. Padme placed a hand on her belly. She was in her final weeks now. 9 months, the medical droids had confirmed, though the twins made it feel like she was carrying an entire creche. They were active tonight, more than usual, restless in a way that felt almost responsive to the fear she was trying very hard not to show. She could feel them moving, small pressures against her palm, the strange intimacy of carrying 2 other people inside her body. She had not told Anakin yet that there were 2. She had only confirmed it herself 3 days ago, and he had been off-world on some classified mission that the Council refused to brief her on, even though she was a senator with security clearance that should have granted her access. She had planned to tell him tonight when he returned. If he returned, she pushed the thought down and focused on breathing. Panic helped no one. Panic got people killed, and she had spent 10 years in politics learning how to convert fear into action instead of paralysis. "Captain," she said without turning from the window, "what's your assessment?" Typho appeared at her side. His cybernetic eye gleamed in the low light. 3 fires, no obvious pattern, no claim of responsibility. Military traffic is up 40% in the last hour. Mostly clone trooper deployments, but the vectors don't match standard patrol routes. Meaning someone's repositioning assets for something that isn't public knowledge yet. Padme turned to face him. "And if that something involves this building, then we evacuate to the Senate's secure level and wait for the situation to clarify." He paused. "Senator, I strongly recommend we move now, before..." The door chime sounded. Everyone in the room froze. Padme looked at Typho. He was already moving toward the door, one hand on his blaster, the other gesturing for Dorme to get behind the interior pillar. He reached the door and checked the security monitor. His posture changed. Not relaxation, the opposite. He drew his blaster. "Senator, you need to get to the secure room, now." "Who is it?" 5 clone troopers, 501st markings, no advance clearance, no Senate escort. Padme's heart went cold. The 501st was Anakin's unit. But Anakin would never send his men to her apartment without warning, unless something had gone so wrong that standard protocol no longer applied. "Are they armed?" "Yes." "Hostile posture." Typho looked at the monitor again. "No. They're standing at parade rest, like they're waiting for permission to enter." Padme moved toward the door. Typho stepped in front of her. "Senator, with respect, you're not opening that door until I know what they want. Then ask them." Typho keyed the intercom. His voice came out hard and professional. "State your business." The lead trooper's voice came through the speaker, calm, slightly distorted by the helmet's vocabulator, carrying none of the aggression that would have preceded a hostile action. "General Skywalker has ordered a protective detail assigned to Senator Amidala. We're here to ensure her safety. No one enters this apartment without clearance. No one leaves without escort." Typho looked at Padme. She could see the calculation running behind his eyes. Clone troopers showing up unannounced at a senator's door in the middle of a citywide crisis was either a protection detail or the prelude to an arrest. The only way to know which was to open the door and find out. Padme made the decision for him. She reached past Typho and keyed the door release. The door slid open. 5 troopers stood in the corridor. Full armor, weapons holstered but accessible, positioned in a formation that put the most experienced soldier at the front, and the others arrayed to cover the corridor's approach vectors. The lead trooper stepped forward and removed his helmet. He was young. They were all young. The clones aged faster than natural humans, but this one couldn't have been more than 3 years out of the Camino and growth chambers. His face was identical to every other clone's face, but the scar across his left eyebrow and the particular way he held his helmet against his hip marked him as an individual in a way the Caminoans had never intended. "Senator Amidala," he nodded respectfully. "I'm CT 4789. The general sent us to keep you secure until he can get here himself." "Where is he?" Padme heard the edge in her own voice and didn't care. "What's happening?" "I don't have full operational details, ma'am. I know there's a situation developing at the Senate and the Temple. General Skywalker is handling it. He wanted to make sure you were safe before..." The trooper stopped. His jaw worked like he was deciding whether to finish the sentence. Before what? Padmé pressed. The trooper looked at her. Something in his expression, some small crack in the professional neutrality, suggested he knew more than he was saying, and wasn't sure how much of it he was authorized to share. Before things get worse, ma'am, Typho still had his blaster drawn. Senator, I need to verify this order through official channels before I let anyone— You won't be able to, the trooper said. The general's operating outside standard command structure right now. I can't explain why, but I can tell you that if he sent us here, it's because the threat is real. Padmé looked at the 5 men standing in her corridor. Clone troopers, identical faces, identical armor, the Republic's manufactured soldiers, bred for obedience and war. Anakin had commanded men like these for 3 years. She had met dozens of them, some briefly, some long enough to learn that beneath the uniform they were people with preferences and fears and the kind of dark humor that came from living in a war that would never let them go home because they had no home to go to. She trusted Anakin. She didn't know if she trusted these men. Then she felt it. A touch in the Force, gentle, deliberate, carrying a texture she would have recognized across a star system. Anakin's presence, reaching across the distance between wherever he was and where she stood. He didn't send words. He didn't need to. The touch itself was the message. I'm here. You're safe. Trust them. The connection held for one breath. Then it released, and he was gone. Pulled back to whatever crisis he was handling that required him to send armed men to her door instead of coming himself. Padmé looked at Typho. Let them in, Senator. Let them in, Captain. That's an order. Typho's jaw tightened. Then he holstered his blaster and stepped aside. The 5 troopers entered. They moved with the efficiency of men who had done this before. 2 took positions at the door. 1 moved to the window to establish overwatch on the approach vectors. 1 stayed mobile in the center of the room. And the lead trooper remained near Padmé without crowding her. CT 4789 looked at Typho. You're her head of security? I am. Good. We'll coordinate. You know the building's layout better than we do. We know what to watch for if someone tries to breach. Typho studied him for a moment, then nodded. What are we watching for? Anyone who isn't supposed to be here. It was a non-answer, but the tone carried enough weight that Typho didn't push. He moved toward the trooper at the window and began a quiet conversation about sight lines and approach corridors. Padmé sat down on the edge of the sofa. The sudden relief of being off her feet made her aware of how tired she was. Not the exhaustion of a long day, the deeper fatigue that came from being 9 months pregnant and carrying twins who were using her ribcage as a sparring arena. Dorme appeared beside her with a glass of water. Senator, you should rest. I'm fine. You're terrified. Padmé took the water. Dorme wasn't wrong. She was terrified. She just didn't have the luxury of showing it. CT 4789 approached but kept a respectful distance. Senator, is there anyone you need to contact? Family, staff, anyone who might try to reach you tonight? Why? The general was very specific about who gets access to you. Padmé looked at him. What exactly did he tell you? The trooper hesitated. Then, he said that if anyone tried to get to you who wasn't him, or someone he personally cleared, we were to treat it as a hostile action and respond accordingly. Hostile action, Padmé repeated. You mean kill them? If necessary, ma'am. The room went very quiet. Padmé set the water glass down. Her hands were shaking slightly and she didn't want anyone to see it. What is he expecting to happen tonight? I don't know, ma'am, but I know the general. And I know when he's afraid he gets very precise about priorities. Right now, his priority is you. Across the room, the trooper at the window stiffened. Contact. Southeast approach. 2 speeders. Civilian profile but moving too fast for standard traffic. CT 4789 was at the window in 3 steps. He looked out, then back at his men. Defensive posture. Nobody fires unless I give the word. The 5 troopers shifted, not into attack positions, but into the configuration of a unit preparing to repel a breach. 2 at the door, weapons ready. 2 at the window angles, 1 staying with Padmé, positioned to move her toward the secure room if the situation escalated. Padmé stood. What do you see? 2 speeders, 3 occupants total. Approaching this tower. CT 4789's voice was level, professional, but she could hear the tension underneath it. They're not broadcasting identification. Typho had his blaster drawn again. He moved to the secondary window and confirmed the sighting. They're slowing. Landing approach to our platform. Can we seal the platform access? CT-4789 asked. Already done. They'll have to come through the main entrance, which means building security will intercept before they get to this level. The two speeders landed on the platform 3 levels below. Through the window, Padmé could see figures disembarking. Not soldiers, not in armor, but moving with the kind of purpose that said they knew exactly where they were going. Then one of them looked up toward her window. Even at this distance, even in the low light, she recognized him. Bail Organa. She moved to the window. Stand down. I know him. CT-4789 didn't lower his weapon. Who is he? Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan. He's a friend. That doesn't mean he's safe tonight, ma'am. Padmé looked at the trooper. If Bail wanted to hurt me, he's had a decade of opportunities, and hasn't taken any of them. Let him through. The trooper held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded and keyed his comlink. Building security, this is CT-4789 with Senator Amidala's protective detail. We have friendly contact approaching. Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan. Clear him for access. He looked like he had run through half the Senate district to get here. His formal robes were disheveled, his face was flushed, and he was breathing hard enough that he had to pause before speaking. Padmé, his voice was urgent. We need to talk, now, privately. Bail followed her, and she closed the door behind them. The moment they were alone, he grabbed her shoulders. Not roughly, but with the intensity of someone delivering news that couldn't wait for gentleness. Anakin's marched the 501st on the Senate building, he said. I don't know what's happening, but clone troopers are locking down every exit from the executive ring. No one's getting in or out. Padmé's heart stopped. Why? I don't know, but Palpatine's still inside, and if Anakin's gone rogue, he hasn't. Bail stared at her. Padmé, he's blockading the Supreme Chancellor with an entire legion. That's not. He's protecting the Republic. She said it with absolute certainty, even though she didn't know where the certainty came from. I don't know what's happening, but whatever he's doing, it's not treason. Then he saw her face, the conviction in it, the absence of doubt, and his expression shifted into something more complicated. You know something, he said quietly. I know Anakin. That's not an answer. Padmé placed a hand on her belly. She felt the twins moving again, restless and strong. It's the only one I have. If the city comes apart tonight, you're coming with me. Alderaan's ship is prepped and ready. I'm not leaving you here if this goes bad. I'm not leaving Anakin. Padmé. I'm not leaving him, Bail. He looked at her, then he sighed and stepped back. Then I'm staying until we know which direction this breaks. They returned to the main room. The 5 troopers were still in position. The fires in the lower city were still burning, and somewhere in the Senate building, Anakin was doing something that required him to send armed men to guard his wife instead of being here himself. Padmé moved back to the window. She placed both hands on the glass and looked out at the city. Come home, she thought. Whatever you're doing, come home. The city didn't answer, but somewhere across the distance, too faint to be certain but too specific to be imagination, she felt him again. Just for a moment, just long enough to know he was still alive. Then nothing. The 501st was already in position when Anakin arrived at the Senate district perimeter. He had taken a speeder from the Temple's auxiliary hangar, a civilian model, unmarked, the kind that disappeared into Coruscant's traffic streams without drawing attention. The route from the Temple to Senate District normally took 12 minutes at legal speeds. He made it in 6, flying the speeder through maintenance corridors and restricted airspace with the kind of precision that came from having flown this exact route 1,000 times in training sims and combat drops and late-night trips to see Padmé when the Council thought he was meditating. He landed on a maintenance platform 3 levels below the Senate's executive ring and killed the engine. The 501st had spread across the district like a net. He could see them from the platform, white armor with blue trim positioned at every major intersection, every hangar entrance, every skybridge that connected the Senate complex to the surrounding towers. They weren't engaging anyone. They were simply there, a visible military presence that transformed the Senate district from a government center into something that looked like a quarantine zone. Appo's work. The commander had taken Anakin's vague directive about containment and executed it with the kind of thoroughness that made the 501st the most effective unit in the Grand Army. No gaps, no improvisation. Every position chosen for overlapping fields of fire and mutual support. Anakin descended the platform's access ladder and moved toward the nearest squad position. 5 troopers in a defensive semicircle around the entrance to Hangar Bay 7, one of the secondary bays that served the executive towers. The bay doors were sealed. A junior Senate staffer in formal robes was arguing with the trooper at the center of the formation, her voice carrying the particular indignation of someone who had never been told no by military personnel. Before, "I don't care what your orders are. I have clearance for this hangar, and I am not going to—" The trooper's voice came through his helmet with perfect emotionless clarity. "The hangar is under security lockdown, ma'am. No exceptions. You can file a complaint with Senate Security tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning? I need access now. My shuttle is—" "Not going anywhere tonight, ma'am." Anakin walked past them, without slowing. The staffer didn't notice him. The troopers did. He felt their attention track him through their visors. The small shift in posture that came from recognizing their commanding officer, even out of context. But none of them broke formation to acknowledge him. Good. He had trained them to prioritize the objective over ceremony. He moved deeper into the district. The Senate building itself rose ahead of him like a mushroom cap made of durasteel and political ambition. The central rotunda where the full Senate convened, surrounded by the executive ring where the chancellor's offices and the senior administrative apparatus lived. Anakin knew this building the way he knew the temple. Better, maybe. He had walked these halls as a Padawan trailing behind Obi-Wan during diplomatic missions he didn't understand. He had walked them as a knight, briefing the chancellor on military developments. He had walked them as Darth Vader, enforcing the Emperor's will on a Senate that had been reduced to a ceremonial body, with no power except the power to applaud when Palpatine told them to. He knew where the security nodes were. He knew which corridors had surveillance and which didn't. He knew the access codes for doors that wouldn't exist for another 6 months, but whose authorization protocols were already embedded in the system architecture, because bureaucracies built their security infrastructure years in advance and never updated it. He reached the executive ring's outer security checkpoint. 2 Senate guards in blue armor stood at the entrance. Not clone troopers, career soldiers recruited from Republic worlds and trained for static defense, rather than battlefield deployment. They recognized him immediately. One of them straightened. "General Skywalker, we weren't informed you'd be—" "Emergency security consultation with the Chancellor," Anakin said. He didn't slow down. "I'll clear it with his office directly." Then the one on the left stepped aside and keyed the door open. Anakin walked through. The corridor beyond was empty. Low, light, polished stone floors, the kind of architectural silence that came from spaces designed to make people feel small. He moved through it with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where he was going, because he did. Palpatine's office was 12 corridors and 3 security doors away. The path was written into his memory in 2 layers, the route he had walked as Anakin Skywalker when he came here seeking guidance, and the route he had walked as Darth Vader when he came here to receive orders. He reached the first security door. Biometric lock. Chancellor-level clearance required. In the normal timeline, Anakin's clearance would have been revoked the moment he was officially named Darth Vader, but that hadn't happened yet. As far as the system knew, he was still Anakin Skywalker, Jedi Knight, hero of the Republic, trusted confidant of the Supreme Chancellor. He placed his left palm on the scanner, keeping his mechanical right hand at his side. The scanner read him as valid. The door opened. He stepped through and immediately moved left, out of the sightline of the security camera he knew was mounted in the upper right corner of the junction, ahead. The camera's sweep pattern hadn't changed in the 6 months since he'd last been here. 3 seconds left, 2 seconds center, 3 seconds right. Repeat. He counted the rhythm in his head and moved through the blind spot during the transition. Second security door. This one required a code rather than biometric authentication. He keyed in the 8-digit sequence that Palpatine had given him 2 years ago, ostensibly for emergency access during a security crisis. Actually, because Palpatine had been grooming him for exactly this kind of unquestioned access since the day they met. The door opened. He was in the inner executive corridor now. Palpatine's private office was 4 doors ahead on the right. The Chancellor's guard, The red-armored elite that would eventually become the Emperor's royal guard would be stationed outside. Two of them, always two, ceremonial force pikes that were also functional weapons if the situation required it. Anakin stopped at the corridor junction and reached out through the force. He felt them. Two presences, disciplined and alert, standing exactly where they should be. He also felt something else, a faint distortion in their force signatures, the texture of people who had been touched by the dark side without being consumed by it. Palpatine's personal guards weren't Sith, but they weren't normal soldiers either. They had been conditioned, trained in techniques that skirted the edge of Sith doctrine without crossing into territory that would make them too dangerous to control. In another life, Anakin had helped select them. He pulled back from the Force sense and moved forward. The two guards came into view as he rounded the corner. Red armor, pikes held in formal rest position, helmets angled toward him the moment he entered their peripheral vision. They didn't move to intercept. They knew him. They had seen him come to this office 100 times. General Skywalker, the one on the left, spoke. His voice carried the flat affect of someone who had been trained to show no curiosity about anything they witnessed in the course of their duties. The Chancellor is not expecting you. Emergency briefing, Anakin said. Military situation developing in the Temple District. He'll want to hear this directly. The guard tilted his head slightly, a micro-movement that suggested he was accessing a comlink channel that Anakin couldn't hear. Confirming with someone. Palpatine, probably, or one of the Chancellor's personal aides who screened access when the Sith Lord was occupied with something that required his full attention. 3 seconds passed. Then the guard straightened. The Chancellor will see you. You may enter. The doors to Palpatine's office opened. Anakin walked through them into a room he had seen in 2 states. Once as the Chancellor's elegant workspace, all subtle lighting and careful architecture, designed to project benevolent authority, and once as the Emperor's throne room, stripped of pretense and rebuilt to project nothing but power. Right now, it was still the former. Palpatine stood at the window overlooking the Senate Plaza, his back to the door. He was wearing the formal robes of his office. Deep red, heavy fabric, the costume of a man playing the role of reluctant leader. He didn't turn when Anakin entered. He spoke to the window, his voice carrying the warmth of a mentor greeting a favored student. Anakin, I wasn't expecting you until the temple operation was complete. Has something gone wrong? Anakin stopped 3 meters inside the room. The doors closed behind him with the soft pneumatic hiss of a seal, engaging. The operation's proceeding as planned, he said. But there's a complication. His face was exactly as Anakin remembered it. The practiced concern, the subtle smile that suggested he already knew what Anakin was going to say and was merely allowing him the courtesy of saying it. The yellow eyes hadn't manifested yet. They wouldn't, not unless Palpatine dropped the mask and let the dark side show through. A complication. Palpatine's tone was gentle, curious. Tell me. Anakin reached into his coat and pulled out a small cylindrical device, a comm jammer, military grade, the kind the 501st used when they needed to create a communications blackout in hostile territory. He activated it. The device emitted a brief high-frequency pulse that would scramble any listening devices in the room, then settled into a low hum. Palpatine's expression didn't change, but something in his force presence shifted. A subtle tightening, the equivalent of a man's hand moving closer to a weapon without actually drawing it. Anakin, he said quietly, what are you doing? Anakin looked at him. The man who had destroyed his life, the man who had groomed him for 13 years, turned him into a weapon, and then used that weapon to burn the galaxy. The man who had promised to save Padmé and then ensured she died. The man who had kept him locked in a suit of agony for 23 years, while whispering that it was all for the greater good. I'm ending this, Anakin said. He ignited his lightsaber with his left hand, keeping his mechanical right hand free. The blue blade cast harsh shadows across Palpatine's face. For one moment, just one, the mask slipped. The grandfatherly warmth vanished. The yellow eyes ignited. And the thing looking back at Anakin from inside the Supreme Chancellor's body was nothing even remotely human. Then Palpatine smiled. So, he said, his voice dropping into the gravel-edged rasp of Darth Sidious, the boy finally understands. 2 lightsabers appeared in his hands from inside his sleeves. The blades ignited simultaneously. Crimson, the color of every Sith who had ever lived and killed and died in service to the dark side. Tell me, young Skywalker. Sidious tilted his head, Did you truly think I wouldn't feel you coming? He moved. The office exploded into violence. Palpatine moved like lightning given form. The first strike came at Anakin's throat, a horizontal slash designed to decapitate, executed with the kind of speed that made the blade look like a continuous line of crimson light rather than a weapon moving through space. Anakin caught it on his own saber 2 centimeters from his neck. The impact sent a shockwave through the office that cracked the window behind Palpatine's desk. The second strike came before the first had fully disengaged. A reversed grip thrust toward Anakin's midsection, the kind of attack that required the attacker to be ambidextrous and insane. Anakin pivoted, let the blade pass close enough to scorch his tunic, and brought his own saber down in a diagonal cut that would have taken Palpatine's arm off at the shoulder if the Sith Lord hadn't already moved. Palpatine was no longer where he had been. He was airborne, flipping backward with a grace that defied his apparent age, landing in a crouch on top of his own desk. Both sabers were still ignited. Both were already moving. Anakin didn't pursue. He held his ground and watched. This was Form 7, Juyo, the ferocity form, Palpatine's preferred style, the one he had used to kill 3 Jedi Masters in the opening seconds of a fight in another timeline. It was built on escalation, each attack faster than the last, each combination more aggressive, designed to overwhelm the opponent's defensive capability through sheer relentless pressure, until an opening appeared and the kill strike landed. It was also exhausting. Palpatine came off the desk in a spinning attack that brought both blades down in a scissor pattern meant to trap Anakin's saber and break his guard. Anakin stepped inside the pattern instead of blocking it, close enough that the blades passed behind his shoulders, and drove his left elbow into Palpatine's sternum. The Sith Lord staggered. Not much. Half a step. But it was the first moment in the engagement where Palpatine had moved in a direction he hadn't chosen. Anakin pressed. He attacked with a Gemso combination. 3 heavy overhead strikes, each one building momentum, each one designed to force the opponent backward. Palpatine parried all 3, but he gave ground. 2 meters. 3. His back hit the wall. Then he smiled. "You've improved," Palpatine said. His voice was still the gravel rasp of Sidious, but there was genuine curiosity in it now. The last time we sparred, you couldn't hold a defensive sequence for more than 6 exchanges before your impatience broke your form. Now you fight like someone who's been trained by a master who actually knew what he was doing. Anakin didn't answer. He attacked again, a low sweep that transitioned into a thrust, the kind of combination that required the defender to shift their weight twice in opposite directions within a single second. Palpatine shifted. Then he blurred. Force speed. The technique that made a Force user move faster than an unaugmented opponent could track. Palpatine used it to close the distance between himself and Anakin, in the space between heartbeats, and suddenly both of his blades were inside Anakin's guard, one angled at his throat, the other at his chest, and there was no time to block both. Anakin let go of his lightsaber. The blade deactivated the moment it left his left hand. He dropped into a crouch, let both of Palpatine's strikes pass over his head, and drove his mechanical right fist into the Sith Lord's knee with a Force-augmented strike that shattered the joint. Palpatine screamed. It was not a dignified sound. It was the raw animal noise of a man whose body had just told him something was very wrong, and for one moment the mask came off entirely. No grandfatherly warmth. No Sith Lord serenity. Just an old man who had just taken a crippling injury and didn't know how. Anakin called his lightsaber back to his left hand. It flew across the room and slapped into his palm, reigniting as it arrived. He brought the blade to Palpatine's throat, while the Sith Lord was still processing the pain. "Don't move." His face was twisted in agony, his weight balanced on one leg, both of his sabers still ignited, but held low in a posture that was no longer offensive. He looked at Anakin with an expression that was equal parts fury and something that might have been respect. "How?" Palpatine's voice was strained. "You were never this precise, never this controlled. I had a good teacher." Anakin kept his blade steady. "You taught me everything I needed to know about how you fight. You just didn't know you were teaching me." Palpatine's yellow eyes narrowed. "You're not making sense, boy." "I know." Anakin reached out with his left hand, not physically, through the Force, and seized both of Palpatine's lightsabers with a telekinetic grip strong enough to rip them from the Sith Lord's hands. The weapons flew across the room and clattered against the far wall, their blades deactivating as they fell. Palpatine sagged. Without the sabers, without the ability to stand on both legs, he was just an old man in expensive robes who had made a career out of convincing people he was more than that. He looked up at Anakin. The fury was gone now. What replaced it was colder, more dangerous. "You're going to kill me," Palpatine said. "Not a question." "Yes. And you think that will save her?" Anakin's jaw tightened. "I know it will. You know nothing." Palpatine's voice dropped into something quieter, more intimate. The voice he had used in 1,000 private conversations when he was grooming Anakin into the weapon he needed. "You think I'm the threat. You think removing me changes anything. But the galaxy doesn't run on hope, Anakin. It runs on power. And power doesn't disappear when one man dies. It just finds a new vessel." "You're right." Anakin adjusted his grip on his lightsaber. "Power doesn't disappear, but you do." He raised the blade. Palpatine moved. Not his body, that was still crippled, still pinned. But the force around him twisted, and suddenly the air in the office was wrong. Pressure dropped. Temperature spiked. Every object not bolted down began to vibrate. Then the lightning came, not from Palpatine's hands, from everywhere. The force itself warping into electricity that arced from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, converging on Anakin from 6 directions simultaneously. This wasn't the targeted attack Palpatine had used on Mace Windu. This was the Sith Lord burning through his own life force to create a killing field that didn't care about precision, only total annihilation of everything in its radius. Anakin caught the lightning, not with his blade, with his body. He extended both hands, flesh and mechanical, and pulled the energy into himself, let it flow through his nervous system the way he had done once before, when the Emperor tried to kill Luke and Anakin Skywalker finally chose his son over his master. His midichlorians, 20,000 per cell, the highest count ever recorded, acted like a capacitor. The lightning didn't burn him. It fed him. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he released it. Not back at Palpatine, into the floor. The energy discharged into the office's structural supports with enough force to blow out every window simultaneously. Transparent steel exploded outward in a glittering cloud. The wind from outside rushed in, carrying the smell of smoke and ozone and the distant sound of Coruscant's traffic streams. Palpatine was on his hands and knees, breathing hard, his face gray. The lightning had cost him, more than he'd expected. His body was failing. Anakin walked toward him, each step deliberate, controlled. His left hand held the lightsaber. His mechanical right hand hung at his side, scorched but functional. Palpatine looked up. For the first time in 13 years of knowing him, Anakin saw something in the Sith Lord's face that he had never seen before. Fear. "Wait." Palpatine's voice was hoarse. "Wait. You don't understand what you're doing. The Separatists, the war, it's all held together by my control. If I die, the galaxy collapses into chaos. Trillions will suffer. They'll suffer less than they would under you. You can't know that." Anakin stopped directly in front of him. "I lived through your empire, Palpatine. I watched you rule for 23 years. I watched what you did to planets that resisted. I watched you build weapons that could destroy entire star systems because you were bored and wanted to prove you could. I watched you torture my son to try to turn him into what you turned me into." Palpatine stared at him. "Your son, Luke. You never got to meet him in this timeline. You're not going to." Palpatine's mind was working. Anakin could see it in his eyes. The desperate calculation of a man who had built his entire existence on being smarter than everyone else and was now encountering a variable that made no sense. Time travel. Future knowledge, and Anakin Skywalker who spoke like someone who had already lost everything and come back to prevent it. "You're insane," Palpatine whispered. "Probably." Anakin raised his lightsaber. "But I'm also right." Palpatine tried one last gambit. He reached for the Force, not to attack, to call for help. A telepathic scream, broadcast on every dark side frequency he had access to. A signal to every Sith-trained operative within 100 kilometers that their master was in danger and required immediate extraction. Anakin felt the signal go out. He also felt it hit the comm jammer he'd activated when he first entered the room and dissipate into static. Palpatine's eyes widened. "What did you? I know every move you're going to make. I've watched you make them." Palpatine opened his mouth to speak. Anakin didn't let him finish. The blue blade fell, Sheev Palpatine, Supreme Chancellor of the Galactic Republic, Darth Sidious, Dark Lord of the Sith, architect of the Clone Wars and the Galactic Empire that would never now exist, died on the floor of his own office with a cauterized wound through his chest and no final words. Anakin stood over the body for a moment. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel relief. He felt the same thing he had felt every time he killed someone in the suit. A distant acknowledgement that the threat had been neutralized, followed by the hollow awareness that neutralizing threats was all he knew how to do anymore. He deactivated his lightsaber. The office was destroyed. Windows gone. Furniture shattered. Scorch marks across every surface. The desk where Palpatine had sat for 13 years and orchestrated the fall of the Republic was split in half. Anakin walked to the communications console, the one device in the room that had survived the fight because it was built into the wall and shielded against exactly the kind of energy discharge that had just occurred. He activated it and keyed in the command frequency for the 501st. Commander Appo's voice came through immediately. "General? Status?" "The Chancellor is dead," Anakin said. His voice was flat, empty. "The threat is neutralized. Hold your positions until I give the all-clear." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, "Understood, sir." Anakin closed the channel. He looked down at Palpatine's body one more time. In another timeline, this man had stood over him on Mustafar and built the suit that kept him alive and in agony for 2 decades. In another timeline, he had whispered in Anakin's ear every day that Padmé's death was his fault, that his weakness had killed her, that only through service to the Empire could he atone. In this timeline, he was just a corpse. Anakin turned toward the door. He had work to do. The Jedi needed to be warned. Padmé needed to know he was alive. Obi-Wan and Yoda, wherever they were if they were still alive, needed to receive the message that the Sith were gone. He made it 3 steps before his legs stopped working. He caught himself on the edge of the broken desk with his left hand, his mechanical right hand bracing against the wall. His hands were shaking. His breathing was shallow. The adrenaline that had carried him through the fight was draining away, and what it left behind was the simple physiological fact that he had just fought a Sith Lord to the death, and his body was presenting the bill. He slid down to the floor and sat there, back against the desk, staring at nothing. Across the city, in an apartment at 500 Republica, Padmé felt the moment he stopped moving. She felt the sudden absence of motion, the shift from fighting to finished, and she didn't know if that meant he was hurt, or safe, or something worse. She pressed both hands to the window and reached for him through the Force. This time he reached back, not with words, not with reassurance, just with presence, the confirmation that he was still there, still alive. "I'm coming home," the touch said. "Wait for me." Then it faded, and she was alone with 5 clone troopers, and a city that was burning, and a man she loved who had just done something that would change the galaxy and wouldn't tell her what. She waited. The Chancellor's private communications array was still functional. Anakin found it in the secondary office, the room adjacent to the main chamber where Palpatine had conducted the business he didn't want recorded. The array was military grade, the kind of equipment that could broadcast on every frequency the Republic military used simultaneously, with authentication protocols that bypassed standard security filters. Palpatine had used it to issue Order 66. Anakin was going to use it to undo what remained of that order. He sat down at the console. His hands were steadier now. The shaking had passed, replaced by the familiar numbness that came after combat when the body realized it had survived and began the process of cataloging damage. His right shoulder ached where Palpatine's blade had come close enough to sear skin. His ribs hurt from the impact when he'd thrown himself out of the lightning's path. His mechanical right hand had scorch marks across the knuckles, but still functioned. Small costs, survivable. He activated the array. The console lit up with active channels, hundreds of them, each one representing a different military frequency, different command structures, different battalions spread across the galaxy. Most of them were still carrying standard operational traffic. A few were silent, which meant either the units were in communications blackout, or everyone who would have been transmitting was dead. He isolated the 501st's command frequency first. Appo would be monitoring it, along with every squad leader, every sergeant, every officer in the chain of command. They were still holding position around the Senate district, still waiting for orders, still fighting the inhibitor chips that were telling them to abandon their posts and finish what Order 66 had started. Anakin keyed the broadcast to active and spoke. "This is General Skywalker to all 501st personnel. What I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible. Some of you will think I've lost my mind. Some of you will think this is a trick. But I need you to listen because your lives depend on it." He paused, took a breath. Across the city, in 300 helmet speakers, his voice was arriving with the clarity of a direct command channel. "Supreme Chancellor Palpatine is dead. I killed him 20 minutes ago in his office. He wasn't who you thought he was. He wasn't who any of us thought he was. He was a Sith Lord named Darth Sidious, and he has been orchestrating this war from both sides since it began." Silence on the other end. He could imagine it. 300 men standing in their positions, processing information that contradicted everything they'd been told about the chain of command and the republic they were created to serve. He continued. Order 66 was not a legitimate military directive. It was a trap. A behavioral override command embedded in your neural architecture before you were born. Every clone trooper in the Grand Army has a chip implanted in their brain, an organic control device designed by the Kaminoans on Palpatine's orders. When the order was transmitted, the chip activated. It suppressed your ability to resist the command to kill Jedi, and it made that command feel like it was coming from you, like it was your choice. He heard something through the channel, faint, barely audible. Someone's breathing had changed rhythm. Someone else had moved, armor plates scraping. "It wasn't your choice," Anakin said. "The Jedi you served with for 3 years didn't betray the Republic. You didn't betray them. Palpatine betrayed all of us. He created you to be weapons he could activate when he needed them, and he created the war to give himself the power to activate you." More sounds now. Rustling. Movement. The noise of men who were standing in formation and beginning to react to information that was rewriting their understanding of their own existence. "I know some of you are fighting it right now," Anakin continued. "I know you can feel the chip pushing you toward the temple, toward the Jedi, toward finishing what the Order told you to start. I know it feels like instinct, like duty. It's not. It's a program, and you are not defined by your programming." His voice hardened. "We are soldiers of the Republic. You've bled for it. You've died for it. Some of you have watched your brothers get cut down because you followed orders, even when those orders sent you into hell. You did that because you believed the Republic was worth protecting. You were right. It is worth protecting. But Palpatine was not the Republic. He was a parasite wearing its face." He leaned closer to the microphone. "The chip is still in your head. I can't remove it remotely. I can't deactivate it with a command code. But I can tell you it's there. I can tell you that when you feel the urge to kill a Jedi, that urge is not yours. And I can tell you that every single one of you has the capacity to resist it, because I've seen you do it. I've seen clones fight through impossible situations because they decided their brothers mattered more than the mission. I've seen you hold the line when retreat was the smart choice, because someone behind you needed time. I've seen you be better than what you were made for." Silence. Then a voice came through the channel, rough, strained, carrying the weight of someone who was talking through physical pain. "General." It was Apo. "The chip." "How do you know about the chip?" Anakin closed his eyes. "Because in another timeline, I watched it activate. I watched you kill Jedi Masters I'd served with. I watched the entire Order fall in a single night. And I did nothing to stop it, because Palpatine convinced me it was necessary." "Another timeline," Apo repeated. His voice was flat, skeptical, but not dismissive. "Sir, that doesn't—" "I know it doesn't make sense, Commander. I know I sound insane. But the Chancellor is dead in his office, with a lightsaber wound through his chest, and the 501st is still standing outside the temple, instead of burning it to the ground. And that's because I've been fighting to change what I know is coming since the moment I woke up on those steps." Another voice broke in. One of the sergeants. Anakin didn't recognize which one. "General, if what you're saying is true, if the chips are real, what do? We can't just cut open our own heads." "No," Anakin said, "but we can get you to people who can. The Jedi have medical facilities. They have the expertise to remove the chips surgically. It's been done before. A clone named Fives discovered the conspiracy and had his chip removed. He tried to warn everyone. He was killed before anyone believed him. Because the alternative is that you spend the rest of your lives wondering if the thoughts in your head are actually yours." Anakin could feel them processing it. 300 men whose entire existence had just been reframed as a lie told by the government that created them. Then Apo's voice came back, quieter now, almost fragile. "Sir, when you redirected us from the temple, you knew. You knew we were going to kill them if you didn't stop us. Yes, and you stopped us anyway. Yes. Why?" Anakin looked at the console, at the lights representing 300 men who were waiting for an answer that would make sense of the last hour. "Because you're not droids, Commander. You're people. And people deserve the chance to choose who they're going to be." The silence stretched long enough that Anakin thought the channel had cut out. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable. Someone was crying, not loud, not obvious, just the small broken sound of a man who had been holding something down for years and had just been given permission to let it surface. Apo's voice came back, steady now, controlled. "Orders, General?" Anakin felt something in his chest unclench. Apo was still with him. The 501st was still his. "Hold your positions," he said. "Nobody moves until I've secured the Jedi Temple and confirmed that the immediate threat is over. Anyone whose chip is overwhelming them gets restrained, not killed. Restrained and flagged for immediate medical intervention. No one is expendable. No one gets left behind. Understood, sir." Anakin switched the broadcast to a wider frequency, not just the 501, but every clone unit on Coruscant. Thousands of men. Some of them were still under the chip's control. Some of them had already executed their Jedi commanders and were wondering why it felt wrong. He told them the same thing he'd told the 501st. The chips, the conspiracy, Palpatine's betrayal, the Jedi's innocence. He didn't know how many would believe him. He didn't know how many could fight through the programming even if they wanted to. But he gave them the information anyway, because information was the only weapon he had that could fight an enemy living inside their own skulls. When he finished, he closed the channel and sat in the silence of Palpatine's secondary office. The city outside was still burning. The clone army was still scattered across 100 worlds, most of them already deep into the execution of Order 66. He had saved the temple. He had saved Coruscant's garrison. He had killed the Sith Lord. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough to undo what had already happened on Mygeeto, on Saleucami and Felucia, and every other battlefield where Jedi had died in the last hour because the men they trusted had been weaponized against them. But it was what he could do. And it was more than he'd done the first time. He stood. His legs were functional now. The exhaustion pushed down into a part of himself he would deal with later. He had one more message to send. He accessed the Jedi Temple's emergency beacon system, remotely, using access codes that technically he shouldn't have had, but that Palpatine had given him years ago, because the Sith Lord wanted his apprentice to be able to reach the Jedi whenever he needed to manipulate them. The beacon was already active. Someone in the temple had triggered it when they felt the disturbance in the Force, when they realized something galaxy-wide and catastrophic was happening. Anakin overrode the default distress message. He replaced it with 4 sentences, broadcast on every frequency the Jedi used for emergency communication across the entire galaxy. "Darth Sidious is dead. Order 66 was a Sith conspiracy using inhibitor chips and clone trooper neural architecture. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant is secure. Survivors are instructed to proceed to fallback positions and await contact. Do not return to Coruscant without authentication." He signed it with his Jedi identification cipher. The system accepted it. The message went out. Somewhere on Kashyyyk, Yoda, fleeing through the forests with Wookiee guides, received the transmission and stopped walking. Somewhere above Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi, piloting a stolen starfighter with a blaster burn scar across his back, heard his former Padawan's voice and almost crashed into an asteroid. Somewhere on a dead moon, Ahsoka Tano sat in the wreckage of a Republic cruiser and read the message 3 times before she believed it was real. And in Palpatine's office, Anakin Skywalker closed the channel, walked out into the corridor past 2 red guards who were standing very still and looking at the broken windows and the body on the floor, and began the walk back to the woman he had burned a galaxy to save. The walk from the Senate building to 500 Republica took 14 minutes. Anakin could have taken a speeder. He could have called one of the 501st's transports and arrived in 3. He walked instead, moving through the Senate district's lower pedestrian levels, where the crowds were thinner and the attention was focused on the fires in the distance rather than the man in scorched Jedi robes passing through their midst. He needed the time, needed the movement, needed the simple mechanical process of putting one foot in front of the other while his mind processed what he had just done. He had killed Palpatine. The thought kept repeating itself in different configurations, trying to find one that felt real. I killed him. He's dead. The Emperor is dead before he ever became the Emperor. The Sith are gone. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like amputation, the removal of something that had been grafted onto him so long ago that its absence left a void he didn't know how to fill. Palpatine had been in his life since he was 9 years old. Mentor, father figure, corruptor, master. The voice in his head that told him he was special, that the Jedi didn't understand him, that power was the only thing that mattered, and attachment was weakness, and Padme would die unless he embraced the dark side. That voice was gone now. Anakin didn't know what replaced it. He reached 500 Republica as the city's emergency services began responding to the fires. Speeders with medical markings, firefighting droids, Senate security cordons going up around the executive district. No one stopped him. No one asked what had happened in the Chancellor's office, or why there were clone troopers stationed at every intersection. The tower's lobby was nearly empty, just a few residents who had decided not to evacuate despite the visible chaos outside. The lift to Padme's floor required biometric clearance. Anakin placed his left hand on the scanner, keeping his mechanical right at his side. It read him as authorized and opened. The lift ascended in silence. He watched the level numbers climb and tried to decide what he was going to say to her. I killed the Supreme Chancellor. I rewrote the timeline. I stopped the apocalypse. All of it true. None of it adequate. The lift doors opened. 5 clone troopers in 501st Armor stood in the corridor outside Padme's apartment. They snapped to attention the moment they saw him. The lead trooper, CT-4789, the one Anakin had personally selected because his chip response profile showed more resistance than most, stepped forward and removed his helmet. General, the senator is secure. No attempted breach. No unauthorized contact. Good. Anakin's voice came out hoarse. He hadn't realized how tired he was until he heard himself speak. You're relieved. Return to Commander Appo and report for chip suppression briefing. CT-4789 hesitated. Sir, if the senator still needs protection, not from external threats. The trooper looked at him for a moment, really looked, the way soldiers looked at officers who had just come back from something that changed them. Then he nodded, replaced his helmet, and gestured for his squad to fall back. The 5 troopers moved past Anakin toward the lift. None of them said anything. But as CT-4789 passed, he stopped for half a second and said, quietly enough that only Anakin could hear, "Thank you, sir, for telling us." Then they were gone, and Anakin was alone in the corridor. He walked to Padme's door. It opened before he touched the entry panel. She stood in the doorway, 9 months pregnant, carrying twins that would arrive any day now, wearing the simple gown she wore when she was home and didn't need to be Senator Amidala for anyone. Her hair was down, her face was pale, her eyes were red in the way that meant she had been crying and was trying very hard not to start again. She looked at him, took in the scorched tunic, the exhaustion in his posture, the way he was holding himself like a man who had been injured but was refusing to acknowledge it, took in his left hand, flesh, and his right hand, mechanical, scorched but functional. "You're alive," she said. Yes, not a punch, just her open palm against his chest, the impact more symbolic than damaging. Then she did it again, and again, her hands beating against him with the kind of futility that came from needing to do something physical with fear that had nowhere else to go. Anakin let her. He stood there and took it until she ran out of strength and collapsed against him, her forehead pressed to his sternum, her breathing ragged. "You left," she said into his chest. "You sent men with guns to my door and then you left, and I didn't know if you were coming back. I didn't know if you were dying somewhere, and I was just supposed to wait here with our children and hope someone would tell me before." "I'm sorry. Don't you dare apologize. Just tell me what happened." Anakin wrapped his arms around her, carefully, aware of the twins between them, aware that she was carrying the future he had burned the first timeline to ashes, trying to protect. "Palpatine was a Sith Lord," he said quietly. "He orchestrated the war. He activated a kill order on the Jedi. I stopped it. Then I killed him." Padme pulled back far enough to look at his face. Her expression was doing something complicated, cycling through disbelief, horror, understanding, and a dozen other things too fast to name. You killed the Supreme Chancellor. Yes, the Senate is going to fracture into chaos. And then they're going to stabilize. And then they're going to hold an emergency election and choose someone who isn't secretly trying to destroy the Republic from the inside. She stared at him. How can you possibly know that? Because I've seen what happens when Palpatine stays in power. I told you. I lived through it. Padme's hand moved to her belly. The twins were active. Anakin could feel them through the Force. Two bright presences that pulsed with a vitality that made everything else in the galaxy feel dim by comparison. The future you saw, Padmé said slowly. The one where I died. That's not happening now. No. Because you stopped it. Yes. Then she took his left hand, his flesh hand, and placed it on her belly, over the spot where one of the twins was pressing against her skin from the inside. Then you need to promise me something, she said. No more secrets. No more walking out in the middle of the night to fight battles you won't tell me about. If we're going to survive this, if they're going to survive this, I need to know what's happening. Anakin felt the twin move under his palm. Small, strong, alive. I promise. Padmé nodded. Then she pulled him inside the apartment and closed the door. Across the galaxy, the Jedi Beacon's message reached those who were still alive to receive it. On Kashyyyk, Master Yoda stood in a Wookiee emergency shelter and listened to Anakin's voice. The words were simple, factual, devoid of emotion, but beneath them, Yoda felt something he had not felt in decades, the Force moving to a single point of intervention and changing the trajectory of everything that came after. Survived young Skywalker has, Yoda said to Tarful, the Wookiee chieftain standing beside him. Changed the future, he believes he has. Tarful rumbled a question in Shiri-Wook. No, I do not, Yoda replied. But feel it I can. The darkness that was coming, gone it is, or delayed. He looked up at the Wookiee. To Coruscant I must go. See this with my own eyes. On Utapau, Obi-Wan Kenobi sat in the cockpit of the stolen starfighter and read the message 3 times. Darth Sidious is dead. Sidious, not Palpatine. But the message was signed with Anakin's cipher, which meant Anakin knew, had known, had somehow discovered that the Supreme Chancellor was a Sith Lord and killed him without telling anyone in the Council what he was planning. Obi-Wan's hand hovered over the comm controls. He could send a response, demand an explanation, ask Anakin what in the name of the Force he thought he was doing killing the head of the Republic's government without authorization. He didn't. Instead, he set the starfighter's course for Coruscant and began the hyperspace calculations. Whatever had happened, whatever Anakin had done, it could wait until they were in the same room. Some conversations couldn't happen over comms. On the crashed Venator above the unnamed moon, Ahsoka Tano knelt in the wreckage and held the datapad displaying Anakin's message. Rex was beside her, still weak from the chip removal, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. He had watched her read the message, had seen her expression shift from confusion to something that might have been hope. What does it say? Rex's voice was rough. Ahsoka handed him the datapad. He read it slowly, his eyes moving across the words like a man trying to decode a language he only half remembered. The Chancellor, Rex said. He was the Sith Lord the whole time. Apparently, and Anakin killed him. That's what it says. Rex was quiet for a long time. Then, good. Ahsoka looked at him. Good. He gave the order, Ahsoka. Palpatine, he's the one who activated the chips. He's the one who turned us into... Rex stopped. He couldn't finish the sentence. Ahsoka placed a hand on his shoulder. You're not what the chip made you. You fought it. You warned me. Barely. Barely is enough. They sat in the wreckage together and watched the datapad screen. The message was still there, still broadcasting on the emergency frequency, still carrying Anakin's cipher like a promise that somewhere in the galaxy, someone was trying to fix what had been broken. Ahsoka didn't know if she believed it, but she wanted to. In Padmé's apartment on Coruscant, Anakin sat on the edge of the sofa while Padmé cleaned the blaster burn on his shoulder. It wasn't deep. Palpatine's blade had passed close enough to sear skin, but not close enough to do permanent damage. It would heal. This is going to scar, Padmé said. I know. She applied the back-to-patch with the careful precision of someone who had done field medicine during the Naboo occupation and hadn't forgotten how. You have a lot of scars. I don't remember. Anakin looked down at his hands. His left hand, flesh whole. His right hand, mechanical, scarred from the fight with Palpatine but still functional. I have scars you'll never see, he said quietly. Padme finished with the patch and sat beside him. The future you lived through, how bad was it? Worse than you can imagine. Try me. Anakin closed his eyes. He could tell her, he could describe the suit, the breathing apparatus, the way his lungs burned every time the respirator cycled because the damage to his body never fully healed. He could tell her about Mustafar, about the lava shore, about Obi-Wan walking away while he screamed. He could tell her about the 23 years that followed, the Jedi he hunted, the planets he subjugated, the atrocities he committed because he had nothing left except obedience to a master who kept him alive specifically so he could continue suffering. He could tell her all of it. He didn't. I'll tell you someday, he said, when the twins are born and we're safe and there's time. But not tonight. Padme took his left hand, his flesh hand, in both of hers. Then tell me this, are we safe now? Is it over? Anakin looked at her, at the woman he had crossed a timeline to save, at the future growing inside her, at the apartment that was intact, and the city that was damaged but standing, and the galaxy that was broken but still capable of being repaired. It's not over, he said. The war is still happening. The separatists are still out there. The Republic is going to fracture when they find out what Palpatine was. It's going to be chaos for a long time. But, the worst of it, the thing that would have destroyed everything, that's done. We're past it. Padme leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, her hand still holding his, the twins moving between them like a reminder that the future wasn't just something to survive. It was something to build. Then we'll deal with the rest, she said. Anakin closed his eyes and let himself believe her. Yoda arrived first. The ancient Jedi Master's ship, a small Republic diplomatic transport piloted by Chewbacca and Tarful, touched down on the Temple's landing platform 43 hours after Order 66 was transmitted. The platform was still guarded. Clone troopers in 501st Armor stood at the perimeter, but their posture had changed. They weren't in siege formation. They were at parade rest, weapons holstered, the stance of soldiers providing security rather than preparing for assault. Yoda descended the ramp slowly, leaning on his gimmer stick, his ears flat against his skull, in the way they always were when he was processing something that disturbed him. He could feel the temple through the Force, still standing, still alive, the presence of dozens of Jedi inside it like candles that should have been extinguished but somehow remained lit. Commander Appo approached. He stopped 3 meters away and removed his helmet. His face was haggard. There were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept since the chip revelation, and his jaw was set in the expression of a man who had been holding himself together through discipline alone. Master Yoda! Appo's voice was formal, strained. General Skywalker is inside. He's been expecting you. Yoda studied him, reached into the Force and felt the clone's presence. Fractured, struggling, fighting against something internal that Yoda couldn't see but could sense the edges of. The inhibitor chip. Anakin's message had mentioned it, a behavioral weapon implanted in every clone's skull. Fighting it still, are you? Yoda said quietly. Appo's throat worked. Yes, sir. It's like having someone else in my head telling me the Jedi are traitors. I know it's not true, the general explained. But the feeling doesn't stop. Strong you are, to resist. I'm not resisting, Master. I'm just delaying. Appo's hands clenched at his sides. Some of my men couldn't. We have 17 troopers in medical restraint right now. Their chips overwhelmed them. They tried to breach the temple 3 times before we could subdue them. Yoda's ears lifted slightly. Killed them, you did not. No, sir. The general's orders were clear. No clone gets left behind. No clone is expendable. Appo's voice cracked slightly. He meant it. Yoda nodded slowly. Then he moved past Appo toward the temple entrance, his gimmer stick tapping against the stone with each step. The doors opened as he approached. Shock T stood just inside, her expression composed, but her Force presence radiating the kind of exhaustion that came from maintaining crisis management protocols for 2 straight days without rest. Master Yoda, she bowed. The temple is secure. All surviving Jedi on Coruscant are accounted for. Minimal casualties. 3 Padawans injured during the initial lockdown, all stable. Minimal. Yoda's voice was soft, but there was weight behind it. On other worlds, minimal it was not. Shakti's composure fractured slightly. We've received scattered reports. Master Mundi on Maigito, Master Secura on Felucia, Master Kun over Ketone Moidia. The transmissions are incomplete, but dead they are. It wasn't a question. Shakti nodded. Yoda closed his eyes. He had felt their deaths through the Force when Order 66 activated. Bright presences extinguished suddenly, violently by the very soldiers they had trusted. He had felt dozens of them across the galaxy, too many to count, each one a wound in the living force that would take years to heal. But saved this temple was, Yoda said. He opened his eyes and looked at Shakti. By Anakin Skywalker. Yes, tell me. Shakti told him, the 501st's arrival at the temple steps, Anakin's redirection of them to the Senate district, his entry into the temple to warn Sin Dralig and evacuate the younglings, his confrontation with Palpatine, the broadcast to the clone army revealing the inhibitor chips, the message sent on the Jedi emergency beacon. Yoda listened in silence. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Changed he has, Yoda said finally. Felt it, I did, when reading his message. The same person he is not. Master Yoda, the way he fought, the things he knew, he moved like someone who had seen all of this before. He knew where Palpatine's guards would be positioned. He knew the chip protocol. He knew the future, Yoda finished. Lived through it, he claims. Do you believe him? Yoda was silent. He reached out through the Force, searching for Anakin's presence in the temple. He found it in the meditation chamber on the Eastern Tower. A presence that burned with the intensity of a sun, but carried the texture of something much older than 23 standard years. Believe I do not know, Yoda said. But saved us, he did. Deny that, I cannot. His ship landed hard. Not a crash, but the kind of landing that happened when the pilot was injured and exhausted, and had been flying on stimulants and willpower for the better part of 2 days. He emerged from the cockpit with a blaster-burned scar across his back that had been hastily treated with field medicine, and a limp that suggested Commander Cody's shot had come closer to killing him than he wanted to admit. He saw the 501st on the platform, saw the temple standing intact, saw Yoda waiting at the entrance with Shakti beside him. He stopped walking. For a moment he just stood there on the platform, staring at the temple like a man who had prepared himself to find ruins and couldn't process the fact that it was still whole. Then he started walking again, each step deliberate, controlled. The walk of someone who is holding himself together through Jedi discipline and would collapse the moment that discipline was no longer required. He reached Yoda and stopped, bowed, rose. Master, he said. His voice was hoarse. I received Anakin's message. I didn't believe it. I thought... He stopped. Couldn't finish. Thought the temple fallen, you did. Yoda said gently. Thought all of us dead. Yes. Yet standing we are. Because of your Padawan. Obi-Wan's face did something complicated. My Padawan killed the Supreme Chancellor. The Supreme Chancellor was Darth Sidious, Shakti said, the Sith Lord who orchestrated the war. Anakin exposed him and stopped Order 66 before it could destroy the entire Order. Obi-Wan looked at her, then at Yoda, then back at the temple. Where is he? Meditation chamber, Yoda said. Alone he has been for many hours. Waiting for you, I believe. Then he walked past them into the temple, moving with the single-minded focus of a man who needed answers more than he needed rest. The meditation chamber was empty, except for Anakin. He sat in the center of the room, cross-legged, hands resting on his knees, left hand flesh, right hand mechanical, eyes closed. He wasn't meditating, not in the traditional sense. He was just sitting, being still, existing in a space where he didn't have to make decisions, or kill people, or rewrite the fabric of the timeline. He felt Obi-Wan enter before the door opened. The presence in the Force was unmistakable, calm, disciplined, carrying the faint signature of pain that came from recent injury. Obi-Wan had survived Utapau, had received the message, had come home. The door opened. Obi-Wan stood in the doorway. He looked at Anakin for a long moment. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You killed Palpatine," Obi-Wan said. Anakin opened his eyes. "Yes, without consulting the Council, without authorization, without telling anyone what you were planning." "Yes. Why?" Anakin looked at his former master, the man who had trained him, fought beside him, trusted him even when the Council didn't, the man he had left burning on Mustafar in another timeline, the man whose trust he had spent 23 years mourning because he had destroyed it in a single choice. "Because if I had told the Council, they would have tried to arrest him," Anakin said. "They would have brought him before the Senate, given him a trial, and he would have escaped or corrupted the process, or turned it into a political weapon that destroyed the Jedi anyway. I've seen how intelligent he is, Obi-Wan. I've watched him outmaneuver everyone who tried to stop him. The only way to end it was to kill him before he knew I was coming. That's not the Jedi way. I know. Obi-Wan studied him. You're different. Where Palpatine succeeded, I didn't claim it. I lived it." Obi-Wan crossed the chamber and sat down across from Anakin, mirroring his posture. His movements were careful. The blaster burn was still bothering him. "Tell me," Obi-Wan said quietly. Anakin took a breath. Then he told him. Not everything, not the worst of it, but enough. The fall to the dark side, the march on the temple, Padmé's death, the suit, the Empire, the 23 years of service to Palpatine, the hunt for surviving Jedi, Luke's existence, the moment on Cloud City when his son chose to fall rather than join him. Obi-Wan listened without interrupting. His face was carefully neutral, but his Force presence was in turmoil, cycling through disbelief, horror, grief, and something that might have been guilt. When Anakin finished, the silence stretched long enough that the ambient hum of the temple's ventilation system became audible. Finally, Obi-Wan spoke. "You're telling me that in another timeline I failed you so completely that you became the thing we swore to destroy. You didn't fail me, Obi-Wan. I failed myself. I made the choice. I killed the younglings. I choked Padmé. I pledged myself to Palpatine because I thought it was the only way to save her, and I was wrong. And then I left you to burn on Mustafar." Anakin met his eyes. "You tried to stop me from killing more people. That wasn't failure. That was you doing what a Jedi should do. I should have saved you. You couldn't. I didn't want to be saved." Anakin's voice was flat. "I wanted power. I wanted control. I wanted to believe that if I was strong enough, I could prevent death itself. And Palpatine gave me exactly enough rope to hang myself with." Obi-Wan looked at him. Really looked the way he used to look at Anakin when he was a Padawan and had done something reckless, and Obi-Wan was trying to decide whether to lecture him or just be relieved he was alive. "What happened to you, Anakin?" It was the same question Obi-Wan had asked on the temple steps in another version of this conversation. The same question, but asked with different weight. "I saw what I was going to become," Anakin said quietly. "All of it, every choice, every atrocity, and I couldn't let it happen again." "Again," Obi-Wan repeated. "You keep saying again like it already happened." "It did. In my memory, it did. In the life I lived before I woke up on those temple steps, it happened, and that makes it real enough." Obi-Wan was silent for a moment. Then he did something Anakin didn't expect. He smiled. It was small, tired, carrying the weight of 2 days without sleep and the knowledge that the galaxy had just narrowly avoided an apocalypse. But it was genuine. "You've grown up, Anakin." Anakin blinked. "What? When you were my Padawan, you would have argued with me. Insisted you were right, that you had everything under control, that you didn't need anyone's help." Obi-Wan's smile faded, but the warmth in his voice remained. "Now you sit here and admit fault. Accept responsibility. Acknowledge that you made mistakes. That's not the Anakin I trained." "No," Anakin agreed. "It's not." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Obi-Wan reached across the space between them and placed his left hand on Anakin's shoulder. "Whatever you've been through," Obi-Wan said quietly, "whatever timeline you lived before this one, you came back. You saved the temple. You saved the Order. You saved me." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "You're still my brother, Anakin. Whatever else you are, you're still that." Anakin felt something in his chest break, not violently. Quietly, the way ice broke when spring came and the thaw finally reached the places that had been frozen longest. He didn't cry. He had cried exactly 3 times in the last 23 years, and he didn't have tears left for this. But he felt it. The relief, the grief, the simple unbearable weight of being forgiven for something the other person didn't even know he'd done. "I'm sorry," Anakin said, "for all of it, for everything I did that you'll never know about. For the version of this where I killed you on Mustafar. For—" Stop. Obi-Wan's hand tightened on his shoulder. "That didn't happen here. You made sure it didn't. That's what matters." Is it enough? It has to be. They sat there together, master and apprentice, brothers, 2 men who had survived a war that in another timeline would have destroyed them both, and let the silence hold what words couldn't. Outside, the city of Coruscant continued its slow process of recovery. The fires were being contained. The Senate was in emergency session, trying to understand what had happened to their chancellor. The clone army was beginning the long process of learning they had been slaves, and deciding what to do with that knowledge. And in the meditation chamber, 2 Jedi sat in the ruins of a future that didn't happen, and tried to figure out how to build something better from what remained. The Jedi Council convened 3 days after Palpatine's death. Not the full council. Ki-Adi-Mundi was dead on Megiddo. Agen Kolar had died defending the temple's outer sanctum when a group of chip-overwhelmed clones broke through the perimeter before Anakin's broadcast reached them, and Plo Koon's starfighter had been shot down over Cato Neimoidia by his own wingman. But the survivors gathered in the council chamber at dawn. Yoda, Mace Windu, who had arrived from Coruscant's medical facilities with his right hand in a regeneration cast, Obi-Wan, Shaak Ti, Kit Fisto, and 3 masters who had been off-world during the initial crisis, and returned to find a galaxy that no longer made sense. Anakin stood in the center of the chamber. He had been summoned, not arrested, not accused, but summoned with the formal language that suggested this was a reckoning rather than a conversation. Mace spoke first. His voice was measured, but there was an edge beneath it that came from a man who had nearly died and was still processing the fact that he was alive because someone had intervened in a timeline he didn't fully understand. Anakin Skywalker. You marched the 501st Legion on the Jedi Temple. You countermanded a direct order from the Supreme Chancellor. You killed that Chancellor in his office without Council authorization, and you broadcast classified military intelligence about inhibitor chips to the entire clone army. Mace paused. The Council needs to understand why. Anakin looked at him. At all of them. Masters he had served with, learned from, disappointed, and in one timeline, helped destroy. Because Palpatine was Darth Sidious, Anakin said. Because Order 66 was designed to exterminate the Jedi Order, and because I've already lived through the version of this where I didn't stop it. The future you claim to remember. Believe this, the Council must, to understand your actions. I'm not asking you to believe it, Anakin said. I'm telling you what happened, what I did. If you want to expel me from the Order for it, that's your right. But I'm not going to apologize for saving your lives. Kit Fisto leaned forward. The inhibitor chips. You told the clones they were slaves, that their loyalty was programmed. Half of them are demanding the chips be removed. The other half don't believe the chips exist. The Senate's military infrastructure is collapsing because you told 3 million soldiers they were manufactured weapons instead of people. They deserved to know. Deserved, Mace repeated. That's not a strategic assessment. That's a moral judgment. Yes, the Council was silent. Obi-Wan broke it. The question isn't whether Anakin made the right choice. The question is whether the Order can reconcile what he did with what we are. He looked at Mace. He acted outside our authority. He killed without trial. He revealed classified intelligence without clearance. All of that is true, but he also saved the Temple, saved most of us, stopped the Sith. If we punish him for the methods, we're saying the outcome doesn't matter. The outcome always matters, Shaak Ti said quietly. But so do the means. If we allow one Jedi to operate outside the code because the results were positive, we're not an Order anymore. We're just individuals with lightsabers. Yoda tapped his gimmer stick against the floor. The sound echoed in the chamber's acoustic design, designed centuries ago to make even the smallest voice audible. A question I have, Yoda said. He looked at Anakin. The future you lived, the empire you served, the Sith you became, regret it, do you? Anakin didn't hesitate. Every day, rebuild what was broken. Because I can't. Anakin's voice was flat. I've used the dark side, Master Yoda, not as a mistake, as a tool. I've killed with anger, I've tortured for information. I've done things that can't be undone just because the timeline reset. The Jedi Code says there is no emotion, there is peace. I don't have peace. I don't think I ever will. Then what do you have? Mace asked. Anakin looked at him. Padmé, my children, a life I don't have to build on other people's suffering. That's enough. The council exchanged glances. Then Mace stood. The council's decision is as follows, he said. You are not expelled, you are not stripped of your rank, but you are not granted mastership, and you are not assigned to active duty. Your status within the Order is unresolved. You may remain a Jedi in name, but in practice, you're something else. Anakin nodded slowly. What am I? Free, Obi-Wan said quietly. Anakin looked at his former master. Obi-Wan's expression was complicated. Grief and relief, and the exhaustion of a man who had just lost half his friends and was trying to figure out how to keep living in the galaxy that remained. The war is still happening, Mace continued. The Separatists don't know Palpatine is dead. The Republic doesn't have a chancellor. The Senate is 3 votes away from fracturing into regional blocks. This isn't over, Skywalker. It's just different. I know. Will you help us? Anakin considered. He could say no. He could walk out of this chamber, take Padmé to Naboo, and let the galaxy sort itself out without him. He had done what he came to do. Palpatine was dead. The future he remembered, the Empire, the Purge, the 23 years in the suit, that was erased. But the galaxy was still broken. The clones were still slaves until their chips were removed. The war was still grinding through worlds and lives with no clear end. And the Jedi were going to try to fix it with the same institutional blindness that had let Palpatine operate under their noses for 13 years. I'll help, Anakin said, but not as a soldier. Not as a weapon you point at problems and expect them to disappear. If I'm going to be part of rebuilding this, I do it my way. Mace's jaw tightened. And what way is that? Honest. Public. No more secret marriages. No more hidden agendas. I'm married to a senator. I'm about to be a father. The Jedi Code says attachment is forbidden, but attachment is the only reason I'm standing here instead of kneeling at Palpatine's feet. So either the code changes, or I walk. Your choice. The chamber went very quiet. Then Yoda laughed. It was a small sound, dry and creaking, but unmistakably genuine. The ancient master looked at Anakin with something that might have been approval. Right you are, Yoda said. Failed, the old ways have. Adapt we must, or die. Your terms, Skywalker, the Council accepts. Master, we can't just... We can, Yoda interrupted. And will. Saved us, he did. Trust him now, we must. Or hypocrites we are. The Council voted. 4 in favor, 2 abstaining, none opposed. Anakin Skywalker remained a Jedi. On his terms. 6 weeks later, the Senate held an emergency election. Bail Organa declined the nomination. Mon Mothma accepted it and won by a narrow margin over 3 other candidates who spent the entire campaign accusing each other of separatist sympathies. The Clone Wars didn't end, but they changed. The separatist leadership fragmented without Palpatine's coordination. Dooku's death, Anakin had killed him on Geonosis in this timeline too, though the circumstances were different, left a power vacuum that no one could fill. Systems began negotiating individual treaties. The war became 100 smaller conflicts instead of one galactic apocalypse. The clone army began the long process of chip removal. It was surgical, dangerous, and slow. Some clones didn't survive the procedure. Most did. All of them had to decide what they were going to do with freedom they'd never been designed to have. Commander Apo resigned his commission. He took a civilian name. He chose freedom because he said it was the first thing he'd felt that wasn't programmed, and opened a cantina on Coruscant's lower levels that became an informal gathering place for clones, trying to figure out who they were beyond their designations. Rex found Anakin 3 weeks after the chip revelation and asked him one question: "Did I try to kill you?" Anakin told him the truth. In another timeline, yes, you fought it as long as you could. It wasn't your fault. Rex nodded. Then he saluted and walked away. Anakin never saw him again, but he heard later that Rex had joined a clone rights advocacy group, and was testifying before the Senate about the Kaminoan slave soldier program. Ahsoka returned to Coruscant 4 weeks after Order 66. She walked into the temple alone, found Anakin in the same meditation chamber where Obi-Wan had confronted him, and said, "Sky Guy, you stopped the apocalypse without me." Anakin looked at her, his former Padawan, alive, whole, not the haunted veteran he'd glimpsed in his memories of the other timeline, but still carrying scars from Mandalore and the cruiser crash. "You stopped your own apocalypse," he said. "That counts." She sat down across from him. "Rex told me what you did. The broadcast, the chips, killing Palpatine." She paused. "He also said you told him things you shouldn't have known. Things from a future that didn't happen. He's not wrong. So what does that make you? A time traveler? A prophet? Someone who went insane and got lucky?" Anakin smiled. It felt strange on his face. All of the above. Ahsoka studied him. "You're different. Everyone keeps saying that. Because it's true. You used to be reckless. Impulsive. Now you're—" She searched for the word. "Sad. I have reasons to be sad. Want to talk about them?" "No." She nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "I'm not coming back to the Order. Not officially. I can't serve an institution that let Palpatine happen. I know. But I'm not disappearing either. If you need me, I'll be around." "Good." She stood to leave. At the door, she stopped. "Anakin, whatever future you came from, whatever you did there, I'm glad you came back." Then she was gone. 3 months later, Padmé went into labor on Naboo, not in a medical facility, not in a sterile room, surrounded by droids and emergency equipment. In the lake house at Varakino, with a midwife from the local village and Anakin holding her hand and telling her to breathe because he had no idea what else to do. The twins were born 13 minutes apart. Luke first. Small, loud, angry at being removed from the only environment he'd ever known. The midwife cleaned him and handed him to Anakin, who held his son for the first time and felt something in his chest that had been frozen for 23 years finally break open. Leia second, smaller than her brother, quieter, but with a force presence so bright it filled the room. She looked at Anakin with eyes that were already too perceptive for a newborn, and seemed to be cataloging information for future use. Padmé held them both, exhausted, tearful, alive. "They're perfect," she whispered. Anakin looked at his wife and his children and a future he had burned a timeline to ashes to protect. "Yes," he said, "they are." Anakin Skywalker stood on the balcony of Padmé's apartment, their apartment now, legally registered, publicly acknowledged, and watched Coruscant's sunrise. The city was rebuilding. Slowly, the scars from Order 66 were still visible. Buildings that had burned, districts that had been evacuated, the memorial in the temple's outer courtyard that listed the names of Jedi who hadn't survived. But it was recovering. Behind him, inside the apartment, he could hear Padmé talking to the twins in the voice she used when she thought no one was listening. Softer, less senatorial, more human. Luke was babbling back at her in the nonsense language of 1-year-olds. Leia was silent, watching, learning. Anakin reached into the Force and felt them. 3 presences, bright and warm and alive, the center of gravity around which his entire existence now orbited. He also felt the darkness. It was still there. It would always be there. The memories of what he'd done in the other timeline, the knowledge of what he was capable of becoming, the small, quiet voice that whispered he should take control. That power was the only thing that mattered, that he could protect them better if he just stopped holding back. He told the voice no. He had spent 23 years listening to it. He knew where it led. Instead, he stood on the balcony and watched the sun rise over a galaxy that was broken but fixable, a republic that was damaged but standing, a Jedi Order that was smaller and humbler, and maybe, finally, willing to admit it didn't have all the answers. Padmé appeared beside him. She was carrying Leia, who was staring at the sunrise with the intensity of someone taking notes. "You're thinking too loud," Padmé said. "Sorry, don't be. Just tell me what you're thinking about." Anakin looked at her, at Leia, at the apartment behind them where Luke was probably trying to eat something he shouldn't. "I'm thinking that I spent 23 years in a war I couldn't win," he said quietly. "And now I don't have any wars left to fight. I don't know what to do with that." Padmé shifted Leia to her other hip. "You could try living. I don't know how. Anakin looked at his daughter. Leia looked back at him with eyes that were too old for her face, and he wondered what she saw when she looked at him. A father. A Jedi. A man who carried the weight of a timeline that never happened and always would. Maybe, he said. Padmé leaned against him. The three of them stood on the balcony. Father, mother, daughter, and watched Coruscant wake up. Inside, Luke started crying, probably hungry, possibly injured through his own toddler incompetence. Anakin went to deal with it. There were no Sith to fight, no Empire to resist, no respirator forcing him to breathe in mechanical intervals, no suit, no master, no war, just life. It was terrifying. It was enough. 20 years later, Luke Skywalker stood in the Jedi Temple's training hall and ignited his lightsaber for the first time. The blade was blue, the same blue as his father's. The Kyber crystal had called to him from the caves on Ilum the same way it had called to Anakin Skywalker 2 generations before. Across the hall, Leia watched with her arms crossed. She had chosen not to build a lightsaber. She was training as a Jedi, but her path led toward diplomacy and politics, following their mother's footsteps while carrying their father's connection to the Force. Anakin stood at the edge of the hall, older now, 43 standard years, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes that came from smiling more than he'd ever smiled in the other timeline. He watched his son hold a weapon that in another life would have been used to kill him, and he felt nothing but pride. His left hand, flesh, rested at his side. His right hand, still mechanical after all these years, upgraded and maintained but never replaced, hung naturally, the slight weight difference barely noticeable anymore. Obi-Wan was beside him, older too, still teaching, still guiding, still Anakin's brother in every way that mattered. "He's good," Obi-Wan observed. "He's better than I was at that age. That's not difficult. You were terrible at that age. I was enthusiastic. You were a disaster." They stood in comfortable silence and watched the next generation begin their training in a temple that had survived, in an order that had learned to change, in a galaxy that was still broken, but slowly, painfully, learning how to heal. Anakin Skywalker had crossed a timeline to save his family. He had killed a Sith Lord, stopped an empire, prevented an apocalypse, and now he stood in a training hall watching his son learn to be something he had never managed to be in the first timeline. A Jedi who chose the light not because it was easy, but because it was right. The prophecy had spoken of balance. Anakin had brought it, not through destruction, through choice. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.